Have you ever felt that shiver run down your spine when driving alone at night? That's right. Today we're going to explore 7 scary horror stories involving just that, driving alone in the silence of the early hours of the morning. And the most disturbing thing, all these stories are based on real accounts. So turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and get ready to feel your heart race. Oh, and before we start, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos full of mystery and suspense. Now, let's get started. 1. The Road of Silence. Daniel was a man used to traveling alone. His job as a photographer took him to remote places, and he liked the solitude of the roads. That night, he was driving along the A3 highway in Croatia, a route that cut through vast, deserted and silent areas. It was winter, and the dense fog seemed to swallow up the car's headlights. He knew the road had a reputation for being dangerous, but he didn't believe in superstition. For him, ghost stories were just that, stories. At around 2 in the morning, while driving along an isolated stretch between Staro Petrovo Selo and Nova Gradiška, Daniel spotted something that made him slow down. A figure appeared on the side of the road, almost merging with the mist. It was a woman dressed in white, with long hair falling over her shoulders. She was barefoot and motionless, staring into nothingness. Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. She seemed lost, almost frozen by the intense cold. He hesitated. He didn't usually stop for strangers on deserted roads, especially at that time of night, but something in the woman's expression bothered him deeply. She seemed out of place, as if she didn't belong in that world. For a moment he thought about braking and offering help, but a primal instinct told him to keep driving. He stepped on the accelerator and passed her quickly. A few minutes later, as he tried to shake off the feeling of guilt for not stopping, he felt something strange in the air inside the car. The atmosphere seemed colder than before, as if an icy current had invaded the vehicle. That's when he looked in the rearview mirror and his heart almost stopped. The same woman he had seen on the road was now sitting in the back seat of the car. Daniel hit the brakes hard, causing the tires to skid on the frost-wet road. The car stopped abruptly on the roadside, and he turned to look directly into the back seat. There was no one there. The silence inside the car was oppressive. He sat still for a few seconds, trying to control his panting and understand what had just happened. "I'm too tired," he thought to himself, trying to rationalize what he had seen as the result of exhaustion or his imagination playing tricks. To dispel the growing discomfort, Daniel turned on the radio. The soft music of a local station began to play, but was soon interrupted by static. He tried to adjust the frequencies manually, but the radio seemed to have a life of its own. It switched back and forth between channels full of noise until it tuned into an old song he didn't recognize. The melody was slow and melancholy, almost hypnotic. Suddenly he heard a muffled sound coming from the car windows. Tap, tap, tap. It was as if someone was knocking outside. Daniel looked at the side windows and saw something that made his blood run cold. Handprints had appeared on the glass, which was fogged up by the temperature difference inside and outside the car. The marks were large and seemed to be covered in blood. He accelerated again, ignoring the speed regulations on the deserted road. His heart was beating so fast that he could hardly breathe properly. Each kilometer seemed to last an eternity as he tried to convince himself that it was all a nightmare or some kind of hallucination caused by tiredness. Finally, he saw the dim lights of a roadside gas station in the distance. He decided to stop there to catch his breath and try to understand what was going on. The station seemed abandoned at first glance. The outside lights flickered intermittently, creating unsettling shadows around the old fuel pumps. There were no other vehicles parked there and no sign of human movement. Daniel entered the gas station's small convenience store, looking for someone to help him, or at least confirm that he wasn't going crazy. However, the place was completely empty. The shelves were dusty and almost bare. It looked as if no one had been there for years. As he walked through the deserted place, he heard footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate steps that echoed on the store's worn floor. "Hello," he called out hesitantly, turning around quickly. There was no one there. The silence was broken by a low, disturbing sound, a feminine whisper coming from the back of the store. "Why didn't you stop?" said the voice with frightening clarity. Daniel froze in place for a few seconds before running desperately out of the store and back to his car without looking back. When he got into the vehicle and locked the doors with trembling hands, he noticed something even more disturbing. The bloody marks on the windows had completely disappeared. Trying to start the car with trembling fingers, he finally managed to start the engine and accelerated without looking in the rearview mirrors again, fearful of seeing something he didn't want to face again. When he arrived at his destination in Zagreb hours later, he was as pale and exhausted as he had ever been in his life. For days after the incident, Daniel obsessively researched the A3 highway and discovered disturbing stories involving that particular stretch of the route. According to local residents and old accounts found on obscure online forums, many drivers reported encounters with mysterious figures on that road, especially a woman dressed in white who would appear hitchhiking or mysteriously appear inside vehicles. Legend had it that the road was built on sacred land used as a cemetery centuries ago. Materials taken from these graves were used in the original paving of the highway. Since that fateful night, Daniel has never traveled alone on deserted roads, especially in the early hours of the morning, fearing that he would once again encounter what he knew to be real, but could never fully explain. The A3 highway continues to be the scene of such stories to this day. Some people call them just urban legends, while others firmly believe in the shadowy presence hidden between its silent curves in the darkness of the Croatian night. 2. The ghost truck driver. Carla has always been a fearless woman. She loved driving alone, especially at night when the roads were deserted and the silence helped her organize her thoughts. That night, she was returning from a work trip in Idaho in the United States, driving along the famous Route 95, a stretch known for its desolate landscape and chilling stories. The clock struck 11:45 p.m. and the sky was pitch black, with no moon or stars to light the way. The road seemed endless. Only the car's headlights illuminated the asphalt ahead, and the sound of the engine was Carla's only company. She had heard stories about this highway, tales of truck drivers disappearing, unexplained accidents, and even sightings of ghostly vehicles. But she had never paid any attention to these legends. To her, they were just myths created to scare lonely drivers. As she was driving, something appeared in her rearview mirror, bright headlights approaching rapidly. It was a huge truck, one of those with more than 18 wheels, which seemed to come out of nowhere. It was so close that Carla could feel the vibrations of the engine echoing inside her car. Startled, she slowed down to let the truck overtake her, but it didn't. Instead, it started flashing. Instead, he started flashing his headlights incessantly. "What the hell?" muttered Carla, trying to stay calm. She signaled to change lanes, but the truck followed close behind, like an implacable shadow. The sound of the horn echoed loud and clear in the silent night, making her jump in her seat. Carla decided to speed up. The speedometer rose rapidly as she tried to put distance between herself and the terrifying vehicle. However, no matter how much she increased her speed, the truck's headlights continued right behind her, flashing with disturbing frequency. It was as if it was glued to her rear bumper. She turned at a sharp bend in the road and looked in the rearview mirror again. To her surprise, or rather horror, the truck had disappeared. The relief was momentary. Just a few seconds after taking a deep breath, the headlights reappeared in the distance, shining brightly in the darkness. "That's not possible," Carla said aloud, feeling a chill run down her spine. She tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just some angry or playful driver trying to scare her. But something about that chase seemed wrong, supernatural. The car radio turned itself on and started playing an old song, a melancholy country tune she didn't recognize. The melody seemed to come from another time, echoing through the cabin like a distant lament. Carla quickly turned the radio off, but it came back on by itself seconds later. The truck's headlights were now so close that they illuminated the entire interior of her car. Carla felt her hands sweat on the steering wheel as she tried to find a way out of the surreal situation. She decided to take a detour that led to a less busy side road. Maybe she could lose her pursuer there. But as she turned onto the narrow, winding road, she noticed something even stranger. The truck was already ahead of her, stopped in the middle of the road as if it was waiting for her. Carla braked abruptly and remained motionless for a few seconds inside the car. The truck's rear lights shone brightly in the darkness, but she couldn't see anyone inside the cab through the gigantic side mirrors. Suddenly, the truck's lights went out completely, plunging everything around into an oppressive silence and almost absolute darkness. Carla felt her heart racing as she tried to decide what to do. It was then that she heard heavy footsteps coming towards her car. Slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed to echo in the emptiness of the night. She quickly locked the doors and pressed down hard on the accelerator to get out of there as quickly as possible. But when she looked in the rear-view mirror again, nothing was there. Neither the truck standing in the road nor any sign of the footsteps she had heard moments before. Trying to control her rising panic, Carla returned to the main highway and drove on until she saw the lights of a small gas station on the side of the road. She parked hastily and entered the almost empty place in search of help, or at least someone with whom she could share this nightmare. The attendant was an elderly man with tired eyes who looked as if he had seen everything in his life. When Carla told her story between gasping breaths, he just shook his head slowly. "You saw the ghost truck driver?" he said in a deep, halting voice. Carla frowned in confusion as he continued. "Many years ago, a driver died on this road after losing control of his truck on a sharp bend. They say he haunts drivers to this day." She tried to argue that it didn't make sense. Ghosts didn't exist. But something in the old man's serious gaze made her words die in her throat. "He only appears to those who are alone," the attendant added before slowly walking away behind the counter. That night, Carla decided never again to drive alone on deserted roads in the early hours of the morning. Even years after that terrifying encounter on Route 95, she still avoids talking about it, fearing that just remembering might bring that phantom truck driver back to her silent nights. 3. The child on the road. John was a practical man, used to long journeys and the silence of the roads. That night he was driving along Route 66 in the United States, a desolate stretch of road that seemed to stretch endlessly under the dark sky. The clock was just after midnight, and the only sound was the steady rumble of the engine and the slight hum of the wind against the windows. He liked to travel at night, when the traffic was non-existent and the solitude allowed his thoughts to flow freely. The road was deserted, shrouded in an almost palpable darkness. Only the car's headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the cracked asphalt and occasionally revealing dry bushes on the side of the road. Suddenly, something appeared on the horizon, a small figure standing right in the middle of the road. John slowed down, frowning as he tried to make sense of what he saw ahead. As he got closer, he realized it was a child, a boy of about 8, wearing simple, dirty clothes. He was barefoot and holding something in his hands that John couldn't immediately identify. The child slowly raised his head, revealing large, bright eyes that seemed to reflect the light of the headlights. John stopped the car a few meters from the child and lowered the window. "Hey, kid! What are you doing out here alone in the middle of the road? It's dangerous," he shouted, trying to sound friendly despite his growing discomfort. The boy didn't reply immediately. Instead, he took a few steps towards the car and said in a low, monotone voice, "Can you give me a lift? I'm lost." John hesitated. Something about that situation seemed deeply wrong. Who would leave a child alone in such an isolated place? But he couldn't just leave him there. Reluctantly, he unlocked the doors and gestured for the boy to enter. "Come on up," he said, trying to hide his unease. The child quietly got into the car and sat in the passenger seat. John noticed that his feet were covered in dried mud, leaving marks on the vehicle's carpet. He swallowed and tried to make conversation. "So, how did you end up here? Where are your parents?" he asked. The boy slowly turned his head towards him with a blank stare that sent a shiver down John's spine. "They're not here anymore," the child replied cryptically. John tried to ignore his growing discomfort and focus on the direction. "All right, we'll find help at a post or in a nearby town." For a few minutes, everything was silent inside the car. Then, without warning, the boy started talking again, but his words were strange and disconnected. "Did you know that many people die on this road?" he said in a low, almost whispered voice. "Horrible accidents, cars overturned, trucks on fire. Some people are never found." John felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "What kind of talk is that?" he asked nervously. "You're too young to talk about such things." The boy continued as if he hadn't heard. "Many years ago there was an accident near here," he said calmly. "A car went off the road. Everyone died, including a child." John gripped the steering wheel tighter as he tried to push away the disturbing thoughts that were beginning to form in his mind. He decided to change the subject. "Where are you from? Where should I drop you off?" But when he looked at the passenger seat again, the boy was no longer there. The car was empty. John braked abruptly in the middle of the road, panting and confused. He looked around desperately, but there was no sign of the child, neither inside the car nor on the road behind it. However, dirty footprints remained clearly visible on the passenger side carpet. He quickly got out of the car, with a flashlight in hand, and started searching around the deserted road. He called out for the boy several times, but only the sound of the wind answered. As he walked along the side of the road, illuminated only by the dim light of his flashlight, John noticed something strange in the dust at the side of the road. More small footprints heading off into nothingness, as if disappearing into thin air. Trying to control his rising panic, he got back into the car and locked the doors before speeding off down the lonely road again. His mind was filled with unanswered questions. Who was that child? How had she disappeared, and why were her words still echoing in his head? Arriving in the next town hours later, John decided to recount his experience in a small local restaurant where he stopped for coffee and to try to calm down. When he mentioned seeing a child on the road hitchhiking, the regulars exchanged meaningful glances with each other before an older man finally spoke up. "You found the ghost boy," he said seriously. "Many people have reported seeing this child on Route 66 over the years. They say it's the spirit of a boy who died in an accident around here decades ago." John was silent as he listened to those strangers' stories of sightings similar to his own. Stories of lonely drivers being haunted by living memories of past tragedies. That night, as he tried to sleep in a cheap roadside motel, John couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched, even though he was completely alone in the dark room. 4. The Forbidden Shortcut. Rachel has always been a practical and determined woman. As a project manager, she was used to dealing with complex problems and finding quick solutions. That evening, after a long day of meetings in a neighboring town, she decided to shorten her route home by taking a shortcut she had spotted on her GPS. It was a little-used, almost forgotten road, but it promised to save at least 20 minutes on the journey. To Rachel, It seemed an obvious choice. The night was cold and the sky was covered in thick clouds that hid the moon. The road was narrow, lined with tall trees whose shadows stretched like skeletal hands over the asphalt. The silence was absolute, except for the sound of the car's engine and the slight rustle of leaves in the wind. Rachel felt a slight discomfort as she entered that road, but quickly pushed it aside. "It's just a road like any other," she thought. As she went along, she realized that the road seemed longer than expected. The GPS showed that she should be almost out of the shortcut, but the same scenery kept flashing past the window. Twisted trees, dry bushes, and rusty signs that didn't indicate anything useful. She began to feel that something was wrong when she passed a familiar bend for the third time. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered to herself, frowning as she looked at the GPS again. The screen flickered strangely, as if it was losing signal. The route seemed frozen at a fixed point, indicating no progress. Rachel tried to stay calm and kept driving, but then something caught her eye. Shadowy figures began to appear among the trees. They weren't clear or defined, just vague human shapes that seemed to move slowly between the trunks. She blinked several times, trying to convince herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks due to tiredness. Then she heard it for the first time, a soft voice calling her name. "Rachel." She stopped abruptly, her heart racing. She looked around, but there was no one there. The sound seemed to have come from inside her own head, or perhaps from the trees. Trying to shake off her growing fear, she turned on the radio to break the oppressive silence, but all he got was intermittent static. The voice came back. "Rachel, you shouldn't be here." This time she felt a shiver run down her spine. It was impossible to ignore. Someone or something knew her name and was trying to communicate with her. She hit the gas hard, determined to get off that road as quickly as possible. But the more she drove, the more she seemed to return to the same starting point. The bends were identical. The trees never seemed to change places. Even a rusty sign with illegible letters appeared again and again on her right. It was as if she was trapped in an endless loop. Rachel broke out in a cold sweat as she tried to find rational explanations for what was happening. Perhaps she was disoriented, or her GPS was faulty. But deep down she knew there was something much more sinister on that road. Suddenly, she saw something in the middle of the road, a figure standing under the car's headlights. It was tall and thin, shrouded in dense shadows that seemed to absorb the light around it. Rachel braked again, her heart beating so hard that it seemed to echo in her ears. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, as if waiting for her. "Who are you?" Rachel shouted through the open window, trying to sound brave despite her growing dread. The answer came in the form of a low, drawn-out whisper. "You should never have come in here." Before she could react, the car's lights flashed violently, and everything around her was plunged into complete darkness for a few terrifying seconds. When the headlights came back on, the figure had disappeared. Desperate, Rachel backed up and tried to return the way she had originally come. But again she found the same familiar curve and the same sinister trees surrounding her. The voices increased in intensity. Now there were several calling her name in unison. "Rachel, Rachel, come back!" She began to cry as she drove aimlessly along the endless road. She felt trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The clock on the dashboard seemed to stand still. It was as if time wasn't moving forward in that cursed stretch of road. Finally, he spotted something different, a small abandoned hut on the side of the road. He stopped the car abruptly and ran towards the building in the hope of finding help, or at least some explanation for what was happening. The door of the hut was ajar and creaked slightly in the cold night wind. Inside he found only darkness and absolute silence, until he saw something engraved on the wall, handwritten names in shaky letters scratched deep into the aged wood. Her blood ran cold when she recognized her own name among them. Rachel backed away slowly until she stumbled over the threshold and fell to her knees on the cold ground outside. It was then that she realized no one ever left that forbidden shortcut. It was an eternal cycle designed to trap those who dared to enter it. That night, Rachel disappeared without a trace, just like so many others before her. 5. The mysterious passenger. Peter was an experienced app driver. Working the busy streets of London, he had transported all kinds of passengers, confused tourists, hurried workers, and even discreet celebrities. But that night, something seemed different. It was a cold, damp dawn, with fog covering the streets like a ghostly veil. The clock struck 2:13 when he received a request for a ride in a remote part of the city. The place to pick up the passenger was a deserted street, lined with old houses and trees whose branches stretched out like skeletal arms. Peter arrived at the indicated point and looked around, but saw no one. He thought about cancelling his run, but before he could do so, a man appeared on the sidewalk, stepping out of the shadows. He was tall and thin, wearing an old-fashioned black suit that looked like something out of another era. His face was partially covered by a wide-brimmed hat, and he carried a small briefcase that looked very old. Without saying a word, the man got into the car and closed the door with a slow movement. "Good evening," said Peter, trying to break the ice. The man just nodded without replying. "Where are we going?" asked Peter. The passenger handed him a yellowed piece of paper with a handwritten address. Peter frowned as he read the destination: Highgate Cemetery, an old and partially abandoned cemetery on the outskirts of the city. "Are you sure? It's a cemetery," said Peter, trying to hide the discomfort in his voice. "Yes," the man finally replied, in a deep, monotone voice that seemed to echo in the small space of the car. Not wanting to prolong the conversation, Peter started the vehicle and followed the GPS instructions. The journey was silent. The passenger said nothing, just stared out of the window as if lost in deep thought, or perhaps observing something Peter couldn't see. As they approached their destination, the atmosphere inside the car began to change. The air seemed heavier, and an inexplicable feeling of unease overtook Peter. He tried to dismiss it as tiredness or the strangeness of the situation. They arrived at the entrance to the cemetery at around 2:45. It was a bleak and desolate place, surrounded by rusty railings and covered in vines that seemed to suffocate the old graves. The dense fog made it difficult to see beyond a few meters. "This is it," said Peter as he parked the car. He turned around to warn the passenger, but the seat was empty. The man had disappeared. Peter felt his heart race as he looked around frantically. The car doors were still locked. There was no way he could have gotten out without Peter noticing. It was then that he noticed something strange on the seat where the passenger had been sitting, a worn leather wallet. With trembling hands, Peter opened the wallet. Inside were some old documents. Business cards yellowed by time, and an ID dated 1975. The name on the document was Edward Hargrove, and the photo clearly showed the face of the man he had just transported. Peter got out of the car quickly, looking around in the hope of finding some logical explanation for what was happening. But all he saw was the dark entrance to the cemetery, shrouded in absolute silence. Determined to understand more about the mysterious passenger, he searched the name Edward Hargrove on his cell phone while he was still standing there. To his horror, he found old news about a man with that name, a renowned lawyer who had died tragically in 1975 in a car accident near Highgate Cemetery. It hit Peter like a crushing weight. He had transported someone who should no longer be among the living. Without a second thought, he started the car and got out of there as quickly as possible. All the way home, he felt as if he was being watched, even though he knew he was alone in the vehicle. The next morning, Peter tried to convince himself that it was all just a hallucination caused by tiredness or the spooky atmosphere of the night before. But when he opened the car door to start another day's work, there was his wallet again on the back seat. He's never taken a ride in the early hours of the morning since, especially on deserted streets or to unusual destinations like abandoned cemeteries. 6. The abandoned car. Claire was an independent and courageous woman, used to driving alone on deserted roads. That evening, as she was returning home after visiting a friend in a neighboring town, she decided to cut across a little-traveled secondary road. The road was surrounded by open fields and sparse trees, lit only by the car's headlights and the dim light of the moon. The clock struck almost midnight when Claire spotted something unusual ahead. A car stopped on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. She slowed down, hesitating for a moment. Stopping to help a stranger at that time of night didn't seem like the wisest decision, but her sense of responsibility spoke louder. What if someone needs help? She thought. He parked his car a few meters behind the vehicle and got out, feeling the cold night air envelop his skin. The silence around her was almost absolute, except for the distant sound of crickets and the faint hum of the abandoned car's flashing lights. As she approached, Claire noticed that the vehicle was in good condition, no signs of collision or visible damage. However, something seemed wrong. She looked out of the driver's window and saw that the car was empty. The keys were still in the ignition, but there was no one in sight. It was then that Claire noticed something that made her stomach turn. There were blood marks on the steering wheel and on the driver's seat. The blood looked fresh, dripping in thin lines that stained the light upholstery. A shiver ran down her spine as she instinctively stepped back. What happened here? She whispered to herself, looking around for any sign of movement or explanation. But the road was deserted, and the darkness of the nearby trees seemed to hide secrets she didn't want to uncover. Determined to get back to her own car and get out of there as quickly as possible, Claire turned around and started walking hurriedly. When she got into the car, she immediately locked the doors and tried to start the engine, but it didn't respond. She turned the key again, but all she heard was a dry, disturbing click. Panic began to seize her as she realized that something was wrong with her car too. She looked in the rearview mirror and had the unsettling feeling that she was being watched. She turned quickly to look out of the rear window, but saw nothing but oppressive darkness. It was then that she heard a low sound coming from outside, light footsteps on the gravel around the car. Claire froze in place, gripping the steering wheel tightly as she tried to control her rapid breathing. The footsteps stopped for a moment and then started again, this time closer. "Is anyone there?" she shouted desperately, trying to sound firm despite the fear evident in her voice. No answer came beyond the crushing silence of the night. Suddenly, the lights of the abandoned car ahead began to flash faster, almost frantically, briefly illuminating the surrounding trees with intermittent flashes. Claire felt as if she was trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. She reached for her cell phone to call the police, but there was no signal. Just a blank screen that seemed to mock her desperate situation. As she tried to think of what to do next, she heard another sound, a light scratching on the passenger side door. Claire slowly turned to look, but there was nothing there. Panic took over completely when she realized that the blood marks on the steering wheel of the abandoned car now also appeared to be on the glass of the side window of her own vehicle, red fingerprints that hadn't been there before. With no other option, Claire decided to get out of the car and run down the road in the hope of finding help or at least getting away from that cursed place. With her feet pounding against the cold asphalt and her lungs burning from the effort, she ran until her legs began to weaken. Finally, she spotted lights in the distance, perhaps a house or another vehicle. Hope briefly rekindled in her chest as she ran towards the lights, only to realize with horror that they were the same flashing lights of the abandoned car where it all began. She was back where she started. Claire fell to her knees in the middle of the road, panting and terrified. It was as if she was trapped in an endless cycle, unable to escape that deserted stretch of highway or the invisible forces that seemed to play with her sanity. That night, Claire disappeared without a trace. Days later, drivers reported seeing a car stopped in the same spot with its lights flashing incessantly, but no one dared stop to investigate. 7. The cursed gasoline. Luke was an experienced traveler, used to long, lonely journeys along the roads of the United States. That night, he was driving along a deserted highway in the state of Nevada, surrounded by vast deserts and distant mountains. The clock was almost 3 in the morning, and the fuel tank was dangerously close to empty. When he saw the lights of a small, isolated gas station on the side of the road, he felt an immediate sense of relief. The place looked like something out of an old movie, a simple station with 2 fuel pumps and a convenience store illuminated by fluorescent lights that flashed occasionally. There were no other cars around, and the silence was absolute, except for the sound of the wind blowing across the desert. Luke parked next to the pump and got out of the car. The cold, early morning air enveloped him as he looked around, feeling slightly uncomfortable with the loneliness of the place. An attendant appeared from inside the store, a thin man with deep-set eyes and an expression that Luke couldn't decipher. He wore a dirty uniform and looked like he had been there for decades. "Fill up the whole tank?" the man asked in a hoarse, slurred voice. Luke nodded, handing over his credit card. As the attendant began to fill up the tank, Luke noticed something strange. The man kept looking at him, as if he was evaluating his every move. Trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling, Luke turned to look at the convenience store. The shelves were almost empty, except for a few dusty items that looked as if they had never been touched. When the attendant had finished filling up, he approached Luke with a forced smile. "You should go into the store before you leave," he said, pointing to the lighted entrance. "I don't need anything, thanks," Luke replied politely as he picked up his car keys. "You'd better buy something," insisted the man, his voice now firmer. "Everyone buys." Luke felt a shiver run down his spine. Something about that insistence seemed wrong, almost threatening. Reluctantly, he entered the store just to avoid any more arguments. Inside, he grabbed a bottle of water and went to the till. The attendant appeared right behind him, as if waiting. "Good choice," said the man with an enigmatic smile as he passed the bottle through the scanner. Luke paid quickly and returned to his car, anxious to get out of that strange place. When he started the engine and began driving down the dark road again, he felt relieved to leave the gas station behind. But his relief was short-lived. A few minutes after returning to the deserted highway, Luke noticed something in the rearview mirror. Headlights appeared in the distance. They were off when he first looked, but then they came on briefly before going off again. It was as if the vehicle was trying to go unnoticed. He tried to ignore it at first. Maybe it was just another driver on the road, but the headlights kept appearing and disappearing at irregular intervals. The car seemed to be deliberately following him. Luke increased his speed in an attempt to get away from the mysterious pursuer. But no matter how much he accelerated, the headlights kept appearing in his rearview mirror as a constant reminder that he was not alone. It was then that he noticed something even more disturbing. When he looked at the headlights again through the side mirror, he saw that they were much closer than they should have been given the distance they had traveled. It was as if the vehicle was violating the laws of physics, appearing out of nowhere at points where it shouldn't have been able to catch up so quickly. Panic began to seize him when he heard a low sound coming from the car radio, static, mixed with indistinct whispers that seemed to form incomprehensible words. He switched off the radio immediately, but the whispers continued to echo inside the vehicle. Desperate to escape the surreal pursuit, Luke spotted a secondary exit from the highway and decided to follow it in the hope of losing his pursuer. The road was even narrower and more desolate than the main one, surrounded by dark mountains and dry bushes, but the headlights kept appearing behind him until they disappeared completely. For a brief moment, Luke thought he was finally safe, but when he looked ahead again, he saw something that made his heart stop. The flashing lights of the gas station appeared in the distance, just as he had seen them hours before. He was back where it all began. Confused and terrified, Luke parked at the station again without knowing what to do. The attendant was outside, waiting for him with that same enigmatic smile on his face. "Nobody ever gets to their final destination after filling up here," the man said calmly as he approached the car. Before he could react or fully understand those ominous words, the gas station lights flickered violently, and everything around plunged into complete darkness. That night, Luke disappeared without a trace, just like many others before him who dared to stop at that cursed gas station in the middle of the desert. And those were the 7 horror stories involving driving alone at night. So what did you think? Which one was the scariest in your opinion? Let me know in the comments, I'd love to know. If you liked the video and want to support the channel, don't forget to leave a like, because it really helps us to keep bringing you more content like this. And if you're not subscribed yet, take the opportunity to subscribe so you don't miss out on the next videos full of suspense and mystery. Until next time, and be careful on the road.